Okay, so many times in the past I've made these videos giving analysis of religion, religiosity, attitudes towards and God belief in the United Kingdom. Never done it with regard to the United States. April the 25th, 2018. Less than a month ago, Pew Research Centre released a report, the results of a survey they carried out back end of 2017. When Americans say they believe in God, what do they mean? What I want to do in this video is do what I've done with regard to the United Kingdom on many occasions, and to go through these results, to give my commentary on those results, some of the things that I've picked out as quite interesting, but also to give some criticism and analysis of the commentary that Pew Research has given for their own results. Okay, before I do that, let's just clarify something which you won't need clarifying if you've read a lot of these reports or watched a lot of my videos or other people's videos on these kinds of things. But we need to be aware of what we're talking about and what we're not. Most Pew Research surveys in the United States seem to be in terms of religious affiliation. This survey is mainly in terms of God belief. These are very different things. There are effectively four things that these researchers seem to look at. They fall into four broad categories. You need to be aware of which one. So many times people quote the statistics for one for another because they're not aware of the differentiations made. We have religious affiliation at one end, which is a cultural affiliation. Richard Dawkins even says he regards himself as a cultural Christian, right? And in some surveys, they'd want him to tick the Christian box for that reason. Then we have religious belief. Obviously, Richard Dawkins wouldn't be ticking the box there because it requires that you believe at least some of the tenets of the religion box you're ticking. Then we have religious observance, that you're going to church or you're praying or doing whatever your religion expects you to do to some degree. And then we have God belief, actually believing in a God or gods. These are different things. Pew has tended to centre on this one mainly. We're right over here on the God belief. Just be aware of the difference there. What I'm going to do now, before I get onto the stats, is just to read you the opening paragraph. Previous Pew Research Centre studies, and then it lists a 2015 study, US public becoming less religious, which is another fascinating one. Might do a video on that next month. Have shown that the share of Americans who believe in God with absolute certainty has declined in recent years, while the share saying they have doubts about God's existence or that they do not believe in God at all has grown. These trends raise a series of questions. When respondents say they don't believe in God, what are they rejecting? Are they rejecting belief in a higher power or spiritual force in the universe? Or are they rejecting only a traditional Christian idea of God, perhaps recalling images of a bearded man in the sky? Conversely, when respondents say they do believe in God, what do they believe in? God as described in the Bible, or some other spiritual force or supreme being? Okay, that sets the scene from Pew's perspective. Now let me give you a bit of analysis of the questions. Okay, so the question that's going to take the most analysis is the first question, because that was the hinge for everything that followed. Do you believe in God or not? That was question one, or at least it was more of a question tree, by which I mean TREE, and that wasn't my impression of an Irishman saying three, because they asked a subsequent question with regard to that. So it's quite a sophisticated question structure. Let me just say, like I said, there's going to be quite a bit that I need to say about this first question. It is fundamental. This question was asked right at the beginning. We know from the experience in the United Kingdom that when you ask people whether they have a religion or not, the context in which you ask that question is absolutely critical. The census has traditionally asked that question by trying to frame it in a cultural context, because that is what they're interested in. They ask a couple of cultural questions first, then they ask you whether you have a religion, and they get over 70% of respondents saying they have a religion. The British Social Attitude surveys and the YouGov surveys aren't so interested in that. They're interested in religious belief, so they don't throw in those cultural bones beforehand, and they only get about 50% of respondents. So that's 20% of the population answering differently based upon whether you ask some other questions beforehand. And that is the difference between a question that's looking for religious affiliation or religious belief. So where you fit these questions in is very, very important. This one is right at the beginning, which is nice to see. And the answer to this featured in many of the questions that followed. It set the scene for the questions that followed. So as I say, it was a structured question. In terms of the numbers, it was kind of what we would expect to see. 80% of respondents, do you believe in God or not? But then it structured it down. It winnowed it down to belief in God as described in the Bible, leaving it up to the respondents to decide what they meant by that. Of course, that's very much up in the air, and I'm sure different respondents will have had different ideas of that, but that's the nature of these surveys. But then it created this kind of amalgamated category, really, for belief in some other higher power or spiritual force, which they amalgamated based upon, didn't really matter whether you answered yes or no to the first question, they were interested in that. And then there was the do not believe in any higher power or spiritual force, just down at 10%. 33% of respondents, a third of respondents, didn't believe in God as described in the Bible, but believed in some other higher power or spiritual force. Okay, I had a bit of a problem with that, a bit of a criticism with that, because higher power and spiritual force are very, very different things. And it's very difficult to draw conclusions about what this group of people are actually believing when you conflate these two things together. This is the problem. A higher power, I think most of us would infer from that's referring to some kind of deity, whereas a spiritual force is much more along the lines, in most people's minds, I would suggest, of a life force. Either some kind of life stream that we're all tapped in from and we all return to, or maybe just some kind of force. People don't really know what they're referring to, but just some idea that the material forces that we know about, there's more to it than that. There must be more to our lives than that. We must be imbued with some kind of life force. No need for any deities involved here. It's just some kind of force of nature that imbues living matter and living beings. These are very, very different things, and they're all conflated together. And regrettably, when it came to Pew's analysis of a lot of these questions, well, I'd like to think that they just weren't aware of the difference between these things, but the way they addressed different things showed that they were, and that they seemed to play fast and loose with it. And one question where they wanted to show that actually even amongst this people that don't believe in God as described in the Bible, most of them believe in a deity, they discussed this category by only mentioning the higher power. They said, well, 33% of people may not believe in God in the Bible, but they do believe in a higher power. They didn't mention the spiritual force. But then when they talked about people that had ticked a box of atheist, they said, well, even amongst atheists, 18% of them believe in a spiritual force. Well, actually, no, they didn't. They ticked that box for higher power and spiritual force, but Pew realizes they don't believe in a higher power. So on that occasion, Pew could quite reasonably differentiate how they must be believing in a spiritual force, and the spiritual force isn't a deity. So why weren't they making that link for everybody else? That was a real problem with the analysis, as you'll see. Now, what I would have liked to have done, really, would have been able to compare the data in this to the United Kingdom. Regrettably, I can't because of the way the questions are asked, but it's quite interesting to look at the way the questions are asked because it shows you another differentiation in this question. This is what was asked in the United Kingdom. People have different beliefs about God. Which of the following best applies to you? Listen to the first category. I believe there is a God. What was the question? Pew asked, do you believe in God or not? Listen to the difference. I believe there is a God. Pew asked, do you believe not in a God or not, but do you believe in God or not? Immediately, that means you can't really compare these questions because in Pew's minds, you're inferring a very specific instantiation of God, an Abrahamic God, whereas the YouGov survey left that much more open. The second category in the Pew category was this belief in some other higher power stroke spiritual force, which incorporated people who believed in God. Whereas in the YouGov survey explicitly states, I do not believe in a God, but do believe there is some sort of spiritual greater power. So it leaves people in no uncertain terms that if you tick this category, you're not ticking it believing in a deity. So the questions aren't really comparable. The only category that was comparable there was do not believe in any higher power spiritual force. 10% chose that option in the United States. 33% chose that option in the UK. So that gives you some idea of the difference between the two nations in that regard. Okay, let's move on to the next question. And so the next part was really a bank of three questions that were all along similar lines. Effectively, this kind of interactivity quotient of God. How much is this a personal God that's taking a part in our day-to-day human lives? And they're asking the question and finding the percentage who believe God determines what happens to them, with 48% of Americans believing that most of the time God is playing an active role in what happens to them, percentage who believe that God or higher power protects them, rewards them, etc., and the percentage who say that they interact with God, they talk to God or God talks to them. And it's kind of interesting with regard to these statistics that if we went back to the original question, although only 50% of Americans believe in God as described in the Bible, 77% of Americans believe that there is a God or higher power that has protected them. 75% of Americans talk to whatever God it is that they believe in. Okay, so that's really kind of significant, as you'll hear later on, especially when we talk about this nons category, which I've heard quite a few people talking about in the United States now, and how significant that is. So that's the first point that I wanted to make there. The second point is a point of criticism, really, that goes back again to conflating this higher power and spiritual force. This just shows just how ridiculous it is to conflate those two things. This is what Pew had to say. By contrast, people who say they believe in a higher power or spiritual force, but not in God as described in the Bible, are much less likely to believe in a deity who is omnipotent, omniscient, benevolent, and active in human affairs. Well, no shit. I mean, these are the statistics. They put it in a little graphic for us, look. Those who believe in God of Bible see deity as more powerful, active, than those who believe in another higher power or spiritual force. So here we look, say, in terms of has protected them, 97% of those who believe in God of Bible think God's protected them. Only 68% of those who believe in another higher power or spiritual force believe the same thing. But what use is that statistic? Because effectively what you have there is a category, an artificial category they've created that includes some people who believe in a deity and some people who don't believe in a deity. They just believe in some kind of spiritual force. So effectively all we're being told here is if we have a group of people, all of whom believe in God, you get a higher percentage of those who think that God takes a part in our lives than if you have another group, some of whom believe in God and some of whom don't believe in God. Well, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. What else would you expect? They needed to differentiate there between people who believed in a higher power alone, but not the God of the Bible, without conflating it with this spiritual force of people that aren't believing in a deity at all. So effectively that made that question and that analysis an entire waste of time as far as I was concerned. And I think this next question was a really insightful one. Actually, I want to talk about the nuns in a minute because I know that that's something that people have mentioned quite a few times on YouTube. And indeed, this particular question was headlined by Pew. Relatively few religious nuns believe in God as described in Bible, but most do believe in some higher power. But first, let's just talk about the Christians, because I think a lot of us, when we're comparing the USA and the UK, feel it's not just a difference in the levels of how many Christians there are, but the religiosity of those Christians and how devout they are and what they actually believe. And I think this question, even though the questions that were asked in the UK and the US are differently phrased, in some ways that just emphasizes even more the difference between the two things. The bit that's directly comparable, I don't believe in any sort of God or greater spiritual power. Only 1% of Christians in the USA admitted to that. 9% of Christians in the UK admitted to that. But this is the real kicker here. Belief in God as described in Bible. So this is a really narrow category here. Not only do you believe in God, but you believe in God as described in the Bible. Nevertheless, 80% of Christians in the USA, you've got to take your hat off to them. They're proper Christians, right? They believe in God as described in the Bible. That's what they're saying. 80% of Christians subscribe to that. In the UK, a broader question was asked. Not just do you believe in God as described in the Bible, not do you believe in God, do you believe there is a God? Any kind of God, do you believe there is a God? Nevertheless, only 55% of Christians, only just over half of Christians, were prepared to answer that. I think that really emphasizes the difference between Christianity in the UK, which is overwhelmingly Anglican, and that isn't Anglican is Roman Catholic, and Christianity in the USA, where you've got these much more devout groups taking part, these much more devout Protestant groups taking part, and evangelical groups there. But let's move on to these religious nuns, because this is something that I've heard several times recently, which is the rise of the nuns. It's the biggest rising group in the United States. And I think that a word of caution here with regards to this. We mustn't conflate nuns with people that don't believe in God. The nuns group are people that do not have a religious affiliation, and that is all there is. And as it shows from this question, the nuns, even amongst the nuns, 70% of nuns there are believing in a God or a higher power or spiritual force. And I think you need to take the nuns category for what it is. It's not an expression of not believing in God. It's an expression for a lot of people of not being affiliated with a religion. That is not to say from an anti-theist perspective that it isn't grounds for some rejoicing, I suppose you could say, because I think it's one of the steps on the path. For me, one of the biggest differences between the UK experience and the USA experience stems from that question about Christianity and belief in God, is that it's taken much more seriously. There's a much stronger link people have with their religion. They're much more likely to go to church. They're much more likely to actually believe. They're Christian believers. They're much more involved in that. And the nuns, I think, is a stepping stone. Getting into that nuns category, losing your religious affiliation, even if you haven't lost your belief in God, is a stepping stone to a less religious society, in a society where people are much more likely in the next generation or the generation that precedes that to lose their God belief entirely, and to see the kind of sea change that you've seen in the United Kingdom, in the United States. So what I would say with regard to the nuns is that is not the change in itself, but it's the stepping stone, it's the groundwork to a change which you'll see, which you've seen in the UK and in other parts of Western Europe. But anyway, the next part of the survey sort of carries on from that and has a little bit more look at these religious nuns and breaks it down. And what I found most interesting about this was the part that most highlighted the issues with the survey and this grouping together higher power and spiritual force. And it showed really that the analysis, I think, reading between the lines, I think it was the wrong question to ask. And I think it didn't allow Pew. There's always some emphasis on trying to draw some conclusions, to tease some interesting headline conclusions out of it. And when you ask the wrong question, maybe afterwards you realise you've asked the wrong question, and you can't get the kind of results that you would have got if you'd asked the right question. But Pew, unfortunately, has just ploughed on regardless and just read between the lines as they see fit. Let me show you here. So this was the graph that they had, and you've got the religiously unaffiliated there, which is reported from the last graph. But then they broke it down into atheists, agnostics, and nothing in particular. Forget about the agnostics. Listen to what they say about the atheists and then about the nothing in particular, and look how differently they talk about the belief in other higher power stroke spiritual force category. First with the atheists. None of the survey respondents who described themselves as atheists believe in God as described in the Bible. About 1 in 5, however, do believe in some other kind of higher power or spiritual force in the universe, 18%. So they're looking at that category, and they're not making the audacious claim that 18% of atheists believe in a deity. They're leaving it open because that isn't what the category says. The category says belief in a higher power or spiritual force. Okay, so it's quite open-ended and includes things that aren't deities. However, when they talk about that nothing in particular category, which is the biggest growth area of the nuns, right, this religiously unaffiliated category, admittedly, nearly 90% are spiritual, right? 90% are spiritual, but that doesn't mean that 90% believe in a deity. But this is what Pew has to say. respondents who describe their religion as nothing in particular are even more likely to express belief in a deity. 9 in 10 take this position. So now all of a sudden, now we're not talking about the atheists but the nothing in particular. They've taken the same category of belief in higher power stroke spiritual force and assumed that that is the same as having a belief in a deity. Clearly, manifestly, that is wrong. You know that by the fact that 18% of atheists chose that category, that a substantial percentage of people can look at that category and see things in that category that does not amount to a belief in a deity, and yet all of a sudden they're just factoring all of that percentage in as belief in a deity. I found that particularly dissatisfactory on behalf of Pew there. It really does seem as if they'd asked the wrong question, not being able to draw the kinds of conclusions in either direction that you would like to be able to draw, but just ploughed on regardless and hope nobody noticed the trick that they were playing. Really dissatisfactory there. And now the next couple of results that Pew has decided to focus on are very much the typical demographic fare. Let me take them out of order of the way they presented it, present perhaps the least interesting first, which is about educational level, and it's just what we would expect to see. Which is that the higher level of education, the less likely you are to believe in God as described in the Bible, and the more likely you are not to believe in a God or a higher power at all. Of course, there's the statistic from a few years back that 93% of members of the National Academy of Science in the United States are atheists. And this is very much along those lines, but a substantially lower level. So that's very much in line with what we'd expect, not particularly remarkable. What I found very interesting, particularly in terms of comparing the American experience with the experience in the UK, was looking at the age, the demographics of age, and looking at these different age categories. Now, bear in mind, just let me issue a disclaimer, these categories are not identical, remember, and the age groups are not identical in the UK and the US survey. Nevertheless, I think this gives us a real indication of why the experience has been so different within the UK and the US. Have a look at this. Just have a look at the UK data for a minute. We have that I believe there is a God, and then I don't believe in the God, but believe there is some sort of spiritual greater power. Both of those showed a decline, right? From the 60 plus category down to the 18 to 24-year-olds, from 41% to 25% for belief in God, from 24% halving to 12% for belief in some sort of spiritual greater power. And duly, those that don't believe in any sort of God or greater spiritual power has shot up 22% from 24% up to 46%. All well and good, right? Very much along the lines of what you would expect. Nothing seemingly anomalous about that. A little bit more interesting, the results in the USA. Look at this. So, in the USA, belief in God as described in the Bible is showing the same kind of pattern. It's dropped from 65% to 43%. Big drop, actually. Do not believe in God or higher power has shown the same kind of pattern. It's risen from 7% to 16%. Not a 22% increase, only a 9% increase, but still an increase. The big difference is this belief in other higher power stroke spiritual force, where it didn't follow the same pattern as belief in God as described in the Bible, but has bucked the trend. So seemingly as people have lost their belief in God as described in the Bible, they've not shunted across into this do not believe in God or higher power of any kind, but gone into this belief in other higher power spiritual force, because that has gone up. Only 26% of 65 pluses subscribe to that category, but that's gone up to 39%. Now, as we've said before, we cannot differentiate in this category between those that believe in a deity and those that do not. But if you're comparing it to the sort of UK experience and to what's gone on here, I think it's fair to say that we've got a strong suspicion, strong grounds for suspicion that what is happening here is that people are losing their traditional belief as God as described in the Bible, but still maintaining a belief in a deity, and so jumping into this other category. So rather than what we're seeing in the UK, which was these younger people abandoning a belief in God and just not believing in any kind of deity or spiritual power, instead in the USA they're maintaining a religious belief. They're maintaining a God belief of sorts, but it's just not an affiliated God belief. Very, very interesting, and I think this is maybe something that accounts for a lot of the other differences that we see in the experience between the USA and the UK. And so to wrap it up, I just wanted to look at one more bit. Last bit, but not the least bit, right? It's quite a spicy bit, this, especially if you've been involved in some of the conversations that I've been involved in over the years with people involved in atheist movements in the United States who claim to have all the progressive credentials, and they just so wish that they could get more minority ethnic groups involved in movement atheism, have more faces of colour out there in the crowds, more faces of colour out there on the stage, and yet they're only prepared to appeal to groups on the left, and often quite damning of people that attempt to appeal to groups on the right, as in fact David Silverman did, the now disgraced David Silverman did on a couple of occasions. They'll slam him for that. Have a look at this table here and look at how odds it is with their stated aims. So here we're comparing Republicans and Democrats, but it's actually Republican leaning versus Democrat leaning. So we've got a group on the right. Effectively, we're looking at right-wingers versus left-wingers. And the difference, folks, is all amongst white people. 72% of white people on the right believe in God as described in the Bible. Only 32% of white people on the left believe in God as described in the Bible. Non-white groups, amazingly, there is no difference whatsoever in the stats, whether they're left-wingers or right-wingers. But the real difference that's of interest is proportionally. So in terms of people on the left, white people are going to be more inclined to be receptive to an atheist movement. And the people on the right, white people, are going to be less receptive, one would have thought, based on these stats, to an atheist movement. So what a curious stance it is that those people that seem to be most interested in promoting minority ethnic groups within atheist movements are only prepared to try and draw people from that group for which white people are more likely to be interested in what they have to say than non-white people. Present them with a group of people here, which is the people on the right, where ethnic minorities are more likely to be receptive to their ideas than white people are, and they're not interested in that group. That kind of takes my breath away. Maybe they're not aware of this, but if they are aware of this, I would suggest that if they want to achieve the aims that they state, then maybe they need to take a more politically inclusive frame of mind, as well as a frame of mind that is inclusive in every other way. Well, listen, I hope you've got something out of these statistics. It certainly improved my understanding of the situation in the United States. I'll try and get another video out next month, which will look at some of the other statistics in the United States. But thank you for watching, and bye for now.